Well, welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm so glad that you have come along. We have a great show today. I'm excited to talk to my guest, and I'm excited for you to hear his story, particularly about the Story Church. But you're going to have to get that in just a second. This podcast is brought to you by Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we know there are faithful churches to the faith once for all delivered to the saints all around the world. And we are excited to prepare pastors who are enthusiastic and ready to serve those churches. We're particularly excited that at this point in the life of the kind of pan-Wesleyan world, the Global Methodist Church is emerging. We have, in the last 6 weeks, added 150 Global Methodist students to our student body. So now we have over 450 students, and we're excited to serve them. We are fully online, but we also have an in-person campus in the Jackson, Mississippi area. So we'd love for you to find out more about us at wbs.edu. Also, I'm thankful to my friend Bill Roberts, who's a sponsor of this podcast. He's a financial planner who is particularly gifted with helping people who are serving in ministry to be able to think through things like about housing allowances and all kind of the strange things that happen for people who serve as pastors. And so I encourage you to look at his website. You can find him at williamhroberts.com or a link in my show notes. Finally, I'd love for people to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. If you sign up for that list, I'll send you a free tool. It's called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And it's a 45-minute video teaching session along with an 8-page document to guide you towards the process of going deeper in scripture so that you can present it creatively in a way that connects with your audience. All right. I am so glad to welcome in somebody who I've just heard about recently, Eric Huffman, who serves as a pastor of the Story Church in the downtown Houston area. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Andy, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here. And I'm excited to learn about your podcast and your work too, brother. I'm kind of new to your party as well. So I'm really excited to be making this connection.
Well, I have been a longtime fan of Unbelievable, and I'm still mourning the fact that Justin Brierley has moved away. I have been listening to him for over a decade. And such a big fan of his. And then I was listening to a kind of a random episode. I didn't know he's going to be a pastor sharing with a parishioner, a church member who has some questions. And then I heard your story, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, this guy would be great for not my podcast, but Wesley Biblical Seminary needs to be connected." I'm like, why do I not know more about him? So it's a real treat to hear from you. Tell me a little about your interaction with Justin Brierley in your podcast before we get going on your story.
Yeah, I don't really know how the Justin Brierley podcast thing happened. I think my church member, Grace Hill, emailed his show. Okay. Wanted to ask a question or something. And then Justin said, well, tell me about your church and your interactions with your pastor. And that's sort of how that conversation came to be. And the episode on Unbelievable was just me and Grace sitting and talking through some of her, doubts and questions. Our ministry in Houston has always been about, since we started it in 2015, the Story Church, the mission has always been to inspire non-religious people to follow Jesus. So we've got a heart for the skeptic. A lot of interesting conversations with doubters, happen all the time at the Story. And Grace is one of those. So she kind of facilitated that and made that happen. I've always, like you, been a huge fan of Justin and the Unbelievable podcast. But while we were recording that episode, he told us, hey, I don't know when this is going to be announced, but I'm leaving, Premier Christian Radio and I'm leaving on the Unbelievable podcast. And I don't know what's next for me and all that. So that was a huge shock to us to learn that. But what's interesting is through that interaction with him, we sort of worked on him to come as he figures out what's next for him long term. He's going to facilitate some episodes and produce some episodes for our podcast called the Maybe God podcast. Yeah. And so he's already done 1 or 2 of those. He interviewed me and Bart Campolo, sort of one-on-one, kind of unbelievable podcast style for Maybe God. And so, if your listeners are looking for another podcast to get connected to, I hope they'll check out Maybe God.
You heard it here, folks. Justin Brierley's going to the Maybe God podcast. So check him out. Yeah, man, I didn't know he's on the market. You kind of feel like there was a deal going. Not that I've interacted with him. this moment of personal privilege here. I've occasionally sent a comment or question in, and I love it when people in England say my name. It just sounds so much better. Like Andy, we have Andy Miller the third. I can't even imitate it.
Everything sounds better in that accent, man.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it? Well, I imagine that as we work through your story about the Story Church, we'll get a little bit more about your church, but it's really interesting to me. And let me just start, like, one interesting thing is that a lot of times people, and forgive me for using just sometimes polarizing language, conservative, but like kind of like an evangelical perspective, people think, well, they're not really open to questions. They just want to tell you what you're supposed to believe. I mean, that's not what I hear from you.
No, I think it's because of where I come from and the trajectory of my own story that I really do believe the church should be a place for sort of those, hard conversations that often are challenging, that can seem like, we're allowing heretical things to be said at the church, and,
Sure.
and yet we're willing to wrestle with them. And because I just think, hey, the truth is true, or it's not. If it's true, it's reliable and it's defensible, and it doesn't need us to protect it. So,
Amen.
I think we should always proclaim it and project it with grace and truth. Obviously, the gospel is what it is, but we should also do that with openness in terms of our posture toward people who have maybe heard a false version of the gospel, or maybe they've been hurt by people proclaiming the gospel, or whatever reasons people have for walking away. And I think the gospel can take a little heat. The Bible can take a little criticism. There's nothing about our questions that poses any challenge to God. So why shouldn't we as a church be open as well?
Amen. Yeah, that's the role that we take here at Wesley Biblical Seminary too. We want people to ask their hard questions and work through those questions, and we want that to happen in churches too. You talk about, like, we're not gonna, just because there might be something heretical that comes up. If you were to come to some classes where there's small group discussions, or if you're in a small group at a church, there's probably a lot of heresy there. But it's okay. Right. Like, we have to kind of work through that and, like, be able to listen to where people are before we can lead them to the faith once for all delivered to saints.
That's right. They can ask those questions at the church where they can find truth and correction, or they can ask them at Reddit or online or at the coffee shop or wherever, and just find more heresy. So why shouldn't we open our hearts and ears to the questions of doubters and skeptics? That's sort of our take.
Yeah. And so tell me a little about your experience. You grew up as a pastor's kid, then you became a United Methodist pastor, but it's maybe not the typical story.
Yeah, it's a little different. Some of your listeners might resonate with parts of it. I grew up in the Deep South. The closest town was Texarkana, Texas. My father went into full-time Methodist ministry when I was in the 6th grade. But even before that, he was deeply involved at our local church and sort of became the pastor of evangelism, and then became a part-time local pastor, and then went in full-time. So I feel like I was pretty much raised as a preacher's kid from day one, from the get-go. And I had a really sweet upbringing. I wouldn't change a thing, honestly, about my upbringing in Red Lick, Texas, where, I never had to worry about, anything really, except getting home for dinner in the summertime. And it was a really sweet, innocent upbringing. I think something about that kind of sheltered upbringing did leave me a little bit vulnerable to the rapidly changing world, especially the world of academia. And I don't think I was prepared upon departing, Red Lake Methodist Church. I don't think I was prepared for what was waiting for me on my college campus, even though I went to a Methodist affiliated school. I kind of assumed, I think my parents and others just assumed it would be an extension of my youth ministry experience in a way, because it's Methodist, it's us. And got there, and about halfway through my college experience, I had, for all intents and purposes, renounced my Christian faith. I still called myself a follower of Jesus, but I refused, at most of those times, I refused to call myself a Christian, because I thought Christians were evil. I thought Christians were the ones messing up this country, and Christians, especially conservative, rich white Christians, became kind of the bane of my existence, and the source of all wrong with the world. And I became a disciple of, I guess, what's called liberation theology.
Sure.
Or sort of, I've heard it called neo-Marxist theory as well. I think that's probably more true than liberation theologians would like to admit.
Were you studying theology in your undergrad?
Yeah, I had become a religion major, and honestly, it was in the religion and philosophy courses that I became a heretic or an apostate of sorts, and started denying fundamental things like the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, and assuming, that I knew more than the Bible writers did about all that. And what really rose on Easter was the church, which to me at that point was sort of a social justice movement that was sort of spirit inspired, but in a very new agey kind of a way. All those sort of typical left-leaning academic tricks and tropes that are taking so many captive these days. I fell for it. And I lived that way for the next 13 years. So from age 20 to age 33, I was, I don't think I was a Christian at all. My mama would disagree. My mama insists that I never became anything other than a Christian, and I don't want to hurt her feelings, but she didn't do anything wrong. My parents didn't do anything wrong in raising me. It is my story. And but I think if you're denying the resurrection of Jesus, that's pretty clear evidence.
Right.
you might have fallen away. And so the reality is I was still around the church. It was I think it was my own politics that was my guide. More than, and it was my guiding light. My foundational principle was just my politics. And as much as I could fit the Bible into that framework, I did. And whatever parts of the Bible that didn't fit into that framework, I just left out. So that continued, even though during those 13 years, I was licensed United Methodist pastor.
Yes, this is the wild fact to me.
Yeah.
Like I find it really, you went to beyond going this undergrad experience for being a religion and philosophy and kind of being set in that direction. You went to a seminary. Like, did you get an MDiv or whatever degree might be needed for that experience? And then you went through the process of becoming ordained, but you're saying you weren't a Christian.
Yeah. Right out of college, went to seminary because I wanted to be like the professors who had radicalized me. Honestly, I thought they were the smartest people I'd ever met.
Yeah.
They went to seminary or some theological school. And so I wanted the same. And so I went to a very left-leaning United Methodist seminary and up in Kansas City, and pursued that. During that time, I was further radicalized into my liberation theology and affirmed in my own views. And it's funny, back then, guys like Adam Hamilton and his ilk were public enemy number one.
Interesting.
And we're talked about as being these sort of empire-driven evangelical, colonizers.
Right.
To the extent that, he's right up the road from our seminary, but we hardly ever heard from him in our classes and stuff. It's funny, if you know about how things have shifted in Methodism over the recent years, you'll hear how ironic that is. But
I remember when he was on the cover of Good News magazine.
Yes.
Probably in that same time period, right?
That's right.
This is like kind of a shocking thing if you know where things have come lately. And so then looking back to that period, like you're working through all of these things, but yet affirmed. Yeah. And
in my credo work and all that, I was open about my doubt about the bodily resurrection and how I understood, the atonement to have not been, anything remotely looking like a penal substitutionary atonement in any way. And it was just, it's all sunshine and rainbows and stuff in that world. And that's kind of where the only sin in that framework is corporate sin. And by corporate, I don't mean like a group of us sitting. I mean, like
Right.
corporate America.
Corporations.
Capitalism and the like. That's really the only sin we should be concerned about. Systemic sin and things. And
Right.
there's calling out individual sin is just hate and judgment in that worldview. And that was my worldview. And the work I did for churches then, I was licensed and then later ordained in that as a United Methodist clergyman. I led churches. I started a couple of churches, but they were not healthy churches. And they were a reflection of my own heart, which was angry, rebellious, selfish in a way, but also self-aggrandizing, wanting to show the world how much good we're doing. So we had a soup kitchen, we had a homeless shelter, good stuff, right? On the surface, like youth ministry for urban youth that were sort of discarded by the world. And we did marches. We organized marches for open borders. We organized marches for women's rights to choose, reproductive choice. We said, and none of that. I still believe the church has a mandate biblically to be compassionate to everyone, especially immigrants and refugees and, mothers. And so I still have a heart for some of those issues, but in very different ways now. But in those ways, I was just basically a political operative with a robe and stole.
Wow. I had a similar experience. Now, this might sound funny to some people, and it didn't go that far. And so maybe why it was great that I landed at Asbury University and Asbury Seminary. But even there, I had this experience where I imagine you are about the same age, but this would have been like early to mid 2000s. Yeah. And while I'm there, like these ideas weren't being seen. There's a way that you could be an evangelical and still say, we're into various forms of social justice. And it was like, just went hand in hand. And so I came out of seminary, and this is my decisions that I made, but I looked at the ministry of the Salvation Army that I was leading. I was in Arlington, Texas for 5 years. And then I was in Georgia in the Atlanta area. I even looked at like the Angel Tree program, the work we were doing. I use language, redistribution of the wealth. Like I was thinking like, that's what I'm doing. But I saw that through like a somewhat orthodox lens, but it was interesting. Like what drove me back was realizing like how I could best help people was that when I looked at just giving people stuff and just giving them a place and like not coming to a place where seeing that there are people created in God's image with a capacity to be able to thrive themselves, that then started to pull me back to a more conservative perspective, because I felt like, well, and then I began to see, okay, maybe we need to be careful with some of this language, some of the language of what's implied. And then I actually went to Perkins in your area, and I saw that language for what it was. And it started to really lead me in a place where I was going back to some other principles. And it sounds like we did similar things, but you had it was a more dramatic move.
Yeah, I will tell you, I think, thank God I was saved from that worldview, because toxic isn't even the word for it. I hate to say it because I know a lot of people I care about have this similar worldview today, but it's an evil, an evil system. It's an evil worldview that is, beyond toxic. It's really heinous, and it is. I started to see through it, and I think it was seeing some of the cracks in that foundation that I thought I was standing on at that time that really opened me up to the conversion experience I had later. Yes. But, I started hearing the people I thought were the good guys, the nice white liberals saying things like, there was this fight in the Methodist Church that's been going on forever, the United Methodist denomination, about human sexuality. And the real hang up from the white liberal perspective was Africa. And, if Africa would either get out of the way or if we could teach them to vote our way, then we could have what the church we want. And I started hearing things like, well, eventually those poor people will catch up. They're so rudimentary in their thinking. They're tribal and unsophisticated. They're not like us. by the grace of us, maybe one day we can shape them into being good white Western liberals like us. And I'm starting to hear it. Like,
Oh,
I thought
yeah.
we loved Africans as
Yeah.
liberals. I thought we saw them as equals and we had something to learn from them and not just teach to them. And there was such latent racism.
Yeah. Who's the
In it.
colonialist now? Yeah.
Yeah, there was like a bigotry of the soft bigotry of low expectations is what George W. Bush once said in a speech.
Wow.
And I saw it. I was like, yeah, this is racist.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I heard white liberals say things like, well, we can be offensive in our language toward the wealthy and the powerful and white conservatives or whatever, because it's okay to punch up, but you should never punch down. And just even in a sentence like that, which seems innocuous, I'm like, wait, so you think some people are beneath you and others are above? Like, by what metric? When you say to talk bad about, certain groups is to punch down, you're suggesting they're below you or below us somehow. And I just started to see through and that whole veneer. It's a really thin worldview. And it was sort of those questions and cracks in the system that I was thinking about as I went to the Holy Land in 2013. And that's kind of where
so
everything...
let's get there. This is interesting. I was so surprised as you're telling this story, and I didn't know when I started listening that you're in the same tradition, like in the Wesleyan, United Methodist tradition. And so I was interested to learn that. But you first started to tell about this experience of going to the Holy Land. So tell us what happened there.
So I didn't go to the Holy Land to meet Jesus. Okay. I just want to make that clear. Like, I went to the Holy Land because I had an opportunity to meet with and find solidarity with Palestinian settlers. And refugees that had and were being pushed off family lands for the sake of, these Israeli Zionist settlements. Okay. And so it fits with the worldview I was in a way, because, it was a political fact-finding mission. And I was going to come back and give talks about peace in the Holy Land and things like that from a pro-Palestinian perspective. Right. And I got a lot of that, but that's not all I got. It wasn't even the most important thing I got out of that trip. What I was confronted with in that trip was stuff that flew in the face of much of what I had learned in seminary. For example, I think this was my own stupidity and not doing my own research, but I had come away from college and seminary with this idea that there was scant evidence, if any at all, for the historical existence of people like David in the Bible. And you go to the Holy Land, it's like, well, that ship has sailed. Like, David's existence has been verified, for the last 50 years, really, by archaeological findings and a lot of the latest research. And, his name is all over that land. So, yeah, okay, so David existed. Well, who cares? Whatever. But then you start to be confronted with all this other evidence, like, Nehemiah's wall and Hezekiah's tunnel and, all kinds of historical, on the ground, extra biblical evidence of things in the Bible that, I had sort of my doubts about the Bible had been a huge crutch that I had walked in my liberal worldview with for years. And that was starting to disintegrate. And then I was confronted with the stuff about Jesus, which was overwhelming to me. For some reason, I have trouble finding others who are as overwhelmed by this as I was, but to encounter evidence on the ground in Galilee from the first half of the first century of devout Jewish peasants who no doubt knew Jesus of Nazareth personally, because it wasn't a huge community and he was something of a celebrity. That's historically undeniable. But to see evidence on the ground of these devout Jewish people worshiping a man, and not just any man, but a dead man, who, again, the most historically verifiable fact about Jesus' life is that he died on a Roman cross and he was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Like, those are the most attested to facts about Jesus' existence. Yeah. And if you know anything, as I did out of seminary, I knew at minimum that Jewish people, don't worship anyone but God is like rule number one. And you certainly don't worship a man, but you definitely don't worship a dead man. And you absolutely don't worship a man who died under a curse on a cross.
Yeah.
And yet they were writing on the evidence that I saw was in the house church in Capernaum, which is widely believed to have been the house of Peter. It's not certain, but there was definitely a house church in the first half of the first century. And that's historically, scientifically proven. Like it became a huge gathering place, whereas before it was just a family home. And they were writing on the walls, God, Jesus Christ, Lord, praise Jesus, Mary, Mother of God, calling the dead man God. And it all came to a head for me then. It came crashing together, this sort of reality of Jesus' existence and the reality that apart from Paul, apart from the gospel writers, like on the ground outside of the Bible evidence of first century, in the first half of the first century, so before 50 AD, there were Jewish people worshiping Jesus after he died. And what in the world could have led them to do that? Like knowing what we know about Judaism. Like, and not only for those limited people in Capernaum to do it, but for the movement to spread beyond Capernaum, beyond Galilee, beyond Judea, whatever. It's like, what in the world could have sparked a movement built on such scandalous auspices?
Yeah.
Other than appearances of the man who died.
Right.
Post cross, post tomb, post death. Like, I could not account for the uprising that happened in the church, and for the fact that it was based on such a insane assumption that a man should be worshipped as though he's God.
Yeah. So that moment then changed everything for you. Like, so you come to this truth. You built your life for 10 years, since you left Red Lick. Oh man, like French Lick, Indiana. Okay. I mean, you have a career. Did you have a family at this point?
Yeah, my wife was a pastor too, but she's always been faithful. And I think that she was a lifeline and a tether to me for years. She was always faithful in praying. We fought a lot because she saw what I'd become, and she was ashamed of some of the things I would preach and write for those 13 years, but she didn't give up on me. And we had a toddler and an infant at home at that time. I texted her. I think it was like the middle of the night back home. She wasn't with me, but I'm texting her all these things like, my God, it's all real. It's true.
Wow.
Like, and she wakes up to these texts and she'll to this day talk about, like, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I just knew something crazy had happened. And, I don't even think she could believe that I could be, after all those years, I didn't tell the part about where, as I was wrapped up in that sort of leftist worldview, I was also internally just an absolute mess.
Okay.
Like just addictions and porn and just lust and ugliness. And so there's a lot that had to change.
Okay.
And so, I was absolutely wrecked by the realizations I had about Jesus. And to the extent that I knew we couldn't stay in Kansas City any longer. I knew we would need a fresh start somewhere because so much of my reputation and identity was built around that angry, despairing sort of dark worldview that I had been living.
Wow. So how do you then, you come back from Israel, leave Kansas City, start to build? I mean, you've studied everything. I mean, I guess your wife might have been able to help you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so first of all, on the way home from the Holy Land, my guide, who was an archaeologist and a pastor, gave me a book called The Reason for God by Tim Keller.
There you go.
And I had never heard of Tim Keller at that point in my life. And I read it on the flight home and was absolutely blown away. And I think most people on the Christian left either haven't heard of or have just avoided people like Keller and C.S. Lewis, for that matter, and other people that make sense of the Christian faith. But I mean, there's so much depth and beauty in those writings. And so I came home to Kansas City, started preaching what I knew to be true at that point, which is Jesus is who he said he was. And if he is, we better take him seriously, including we have to take seriously what he said about the Bible and the word of God. And so that changes everything. You can't keep picking and choosing if Jesus is Lord. So that was a radical difference. And frankly, I think I made a lot of enemies, I guess, or disappointed a lot of people who had sort of bought into the old me and wanted me to continue that. And then when I came home, and it was hard. It was some of the hardest times I've had, frankly. But a year and a half later, we made the move to Texas. And a year after that, we started the Story Church in Houston.
So you're working through all these changes of like your worldview. I mean, and you was there a moment? It doesn't have to be, of course, a moment of conversion, so to speak, or was it there at Peter? Yeah.
It was right there on the shore of Capernaum. I mean, it all came together, and I repented. I kept saying, I'm sorry. And then the feelings of total, just crushing guilt, coming up against this overwhelming grace was something I'll never forget. And I won't say everything changed overnight, although I do believe I became a new man that day. But it took me a while to work through the stuff that I had been, surrendering to for years before that. But it was a liberative process in ways that I had never experienced before. And still,
what were your lifelines in there intellectually as you're like reformulating your beliefs? Well, I mean, C.S. Lewis, Tim Keller, you mentioned them. What else did you lean into?
Yeah, I think I went heavy into apologetics because I needed it to make sense in my head, all of it, everything from creation. And, I was all in for evolutionary theory as the answer to all of our questions before my conversion, and I needed new answers. So I went heavy into Alvin Plantinga.
Yeah.
Heavy into William Lane Craig, who I've become friends with.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's preached at my church and been on the podcast, the Maybe God podcast a couple times. And, other pastoral guys like Keller and others have been very helpful to me, but did a ton of reading from like John Polkinghorne. Who is Lennox? John Lennox was very helpful to me. A couple of podcasts were very helpful to me. What are their names? It's a husband and wife team. She is British. The name's escaping me now, but it'll come to me. Amy Orr Ewing has been a real help to me, and several others. But I've just been really fortunate that God didn't give up on me.
Amen. Oh, Eric, it's so awesome to hear this. I'm sorry that we couldn't have like somehow got a Wesley Biblical Seminary flyer under your door, in those days. Like
I wouldn't have accepted it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, okay. So Story Church, tell us about, the Story Church is so closely connected to your story. So tell us about that and what's going on there.
Yeah, we started the Story Church in 2015 as we moved to Houston. It was a part of a larger mother church, St. Luke's Methodist in Houston. And it was just a crazy, I guess, success story by the numbers anyway from the start. The trajectory has been amazing. And then, things happen, COVID. And then we got kicked out of our mother church and left the denomination, all of that in the last few years.
Whoa. Back up here. So you got kicked out of the mother church. I'm not looking for names. I'm not like, and you've been good, like not saying where you went to school and that kind of, I appreciate that. But you kicked out of your mother church. What happened?
Yeah, it was really sparked by, I think the bigger story is we were going one way and the mother church was going another in regards to the United Methodist split. Everybody knew it, but we didn't know what that would mean. And then, even though I wasn't WCA or anything affiliated officially, I was invited to speak at a WCA event. I criticized church leadership at the time, denominational leadership, for not prioritizing scripture as the sort of lens through which to view all of these problems facing the church, and gave that speech on May the 1st of 2021. And I was summarily dismissed from my mother church on May the 4th. of 2021.
Wow.
Thanks to a friendly bishop at the time in Texas, we were given a little bit of a runway to leave. And so we were able to leave with the story. We found a place to rent, a little old Church of Christ Scientists that had closed here in Houston. We started renting that, and we've been here ever since. And recently we purchased a property basically next door to the mother church that gave us birth.
Oh, wow.
So we're moving back to the backyard where we were born in early next year.
I'm guessing that was Scott Jones, the bishop that you're talking about there. He just spoke at our commencement, and we had him here, and so we've really appreciate the work he's doing and the courage that he's demonstrating, and others too, who really have had maybe even his trajectory could have been the same as yours, but it's exciting to see like what's emerging.
So yeah, Scott Jones, Bishop Jones, was a godsend to us. And it wasn't easy. We weren't always happy with him. He wasn't always happy with us, but I'm grateful for him every day, because that situation could have been a heck of a lot worse. And so he negotiated a way out for us. And now I'm not sure I would change anything because of how ugly it's gotten in the United Methodist world. And we never had to have a vote to leave.
Oh, interesting.
We just
what
left.
happened? So you didn't disaffiliate?
We didn't have to. We were part of another church. We were under St. Luke's United Methodist, and so we just left. And my wife and I and our other on-staff pastor surrendered our credentials and established the story as an independent church. Which was never really in our plans. But that's sort of water under the bridge now. It's been amazing ever since. It's been full of challenges and a little bit of heartache here and there. But man, I'm glad we're out of that quagmire.
Bless you. Yeah. I haven't been, I've not been in a United Methodist Church, but I've been very well aware of what's going on there. So I heard you talk about this before. Tell us what happened after you didn't disaffiliate, but after you were your own entity.
Yeah. So after we established the Story Church as an independent church, around that time, we were talking to other churches that were in a similar position. They had either disaffiliated or something similar as happened to us, happened to them. And what we realized is there were things we really were going to miss, and our churches were going to miss from being a part of a connection. There were other things about being a part of a connection like the United Methodist Church that we will never in a million years miss. So we started talking about how can we, really pursue the things that we will miss and we will need, like conferencing as Wesley in the Wesleyan sense, right?
Yeah.
Not in the modern annual conference sense necessarily, but like holy conferencing and accountability, and even more practical things like where our boards go. Local governance goes to solve big picture problems. And, when there's a vacancy at the top, who do our boards talk to? And can we forge a network that could answer some of those questions or be a source of support and accountability? And so out of that came what's now known as the Foundry Network, which I understand you've talked to Shane Bishop about that. He's sort of a partner in crime with me in that. And so that's been fun to watch that develop. It's not, I don't think any answer to these dilemmas we're in now are perfect, but it's been a real blessing to us. So
support and accountability, that's the key thing that you feel like you need. That's not a denomination, but it's what a denomination would have provided in the past.
It's the baseline stuff, but it's more than that. When accountability, when you're United Methodist, just means they make sure you pay your apportionments. They make sure you don't take money. As a pastor, they make sure you don't cheat on your spouse or touch children or whatever. It's like, that's basically the extent of accountability. But, biblical accountability goes so much deeper than that. And pastoral accountability is so huge and important that it's not just about preventing a negative. It's about accentuating positives, in a pastor's life and in a church's life. And so we look to resource each other, with ideas and and suggestions, and we'll speak at each other's churches, or we'll send a staff member to go and educate a whole other church's staff or whatever about something particular. So there's all kinds of ways that that is fleshed out, and we're having fun figuring it out.
Now, this might seem like a straw man sort of argument, but I just want to lay it out there because this is what people might be thinking. But they might say, well, Eric, Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll was a part of a network too, and they're supposed to have accountability. And look what happened after they were exposed and all those challenges, and now the church doesn't exist. Some people think we need more accountability, and that a network's not going to be able to provide that. How do you respond?
I think that's probably right. I think that a lot of churches do need more accountability. For every Mark Driscoll, I guess I could point to another, Rick Warren or some other person who has managed to be locally governed and avoid some of the pitfalls that come our way. I could also point to, for every Mark Driscoll, about 100 United Methodist leaders that were not held accountable. Maybe not.
Yes.
Maybe not when it comes to abusive, overreaching leadership, like Driscoll wasn't held accountable for, but I don't remember any Methodist pastor being held accountable for not making disciples.
There you go.
I know I wasn't. It was just about how many people can you attract on a Sunday and how much money can you bring in. But, if you didn't make a disciple in a year, no one slapped you on the wrist for it.
Hello.
They promoted you. So we can talk about accountability and systems and things, but I just think we need to judge the fruit and not just analyze the systemic choices being made. Let's see the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, and in the Foundry Network, it's really intriguing to me because it is. And most of the people who listen to my podcast are in the pan-Wesleyan world anyways, but it has Wesleyan theology at its core. It has a biblically focused statement on human sexuality. Tell us a little bit more, though, about the Foundry Network.
Well, I think it is. It's definitely Wesleyan in theology, although I think had a lot of people in the Wesleyan world push back against that and say you can't be Wesleyan and locally governed. To be Wesleyan is to be connectionally governed. I'm not sure how
that's
much
so arrogant.
It's a little fundamentalist in my opinion, but I am sensitive to the argument, and I think I've already fielded enough questions and pushback about our theology as an independent church, and especially regarding women in ministry. I mean, the moment we left the United Methodist Church, we had a few people in our congregation start asking, all right, so when can we now be biblical about women in ministry and not having women in ministry anymore? When can we stop baptizing babies? You got people sort of, once the denominational cover's out of the way, you have people sort of coming out of the woodwork to try and push the church in one direction or another theologically. And so you really have to be able to stand your ground and make your case biblically for some of these things that used to be, sort of denominationally covered, which has kind of been nice. I've had the space and had to make the space to make the case for infant baptism in a way that I never had to before. And I feel like was able to do that and teach a lot of people, why we have the historical practice of infant baptism versus believers baptism, and the same for women in ministry. We don't do it in spite of the Bible. We do it because of the Bible. Right. So it's been a good way to stay sharp. As I said before, no one at the Foundry Network thinks what we're doing is perfect or in any way a good solution for most churches. I think for 95% of former United Methodist churches, the Foundry Network's not for them, and we're not trying to grow it. We're not really anxious to grow the thing. We don't have a central office. There's no financial component to it. It's really about fellowship and accountability as much as possible. But I think a lot of us are a little bit denominationally scarred. And so that is sort of charted some of our steps. I think we're so anti going back to whatever that was, that we are a little bit slow to want to get back into anything similar. But at the same time, we are so happy about the success of the Global Methodist Church, for example,
Yeah.
and for churches that have gone free Methodist, or churches that are doing the Methodist collegiate thing and thing out of Florida. It's exciting to see God working in all these different ways. And I think that's maybe his plan through all of this. And I don't think it needs to be uniform. I think we can all champion each other. At least that's our plan as far as the Foundry Network is concerned.
I can't help but jump back to the comment about whether or not it's Wesleyan. And I said, I kind of interjected there. That's kind of pretty arrogant because, if it's really Wesleyan, it's probably going to be, we're going to go back to the Church of England. And there's really a sense like if you really
how far do you want to
Wesleyan,
take this?
And this is a bit like I study the 19th century holiness and Wesleyan kind of world. The emergence of the Salvation Army came in that context, and there's all sorts of splits that happen, and people might not even know this,
right,
that like the Primitive Methodist Church started in the early 19th century. Well, I have a friend who's in a band meeting with me. He is a graduate, double graduate of Wesley Biblical Seminary. He's serving a church that you might not know it, but it's a Primitive Methodist Church from that same tradition. We have Congregational Methodist Church, Evangelical Methodist Church. And I have on my podcast two guys about our age who have like contemporary churches. They're called the Association of Independent Methodists. And they're like, they're thriving, they're growing, and they're growing in part because some people are coming their way, but they're planting churches. So like there's a lot of other ways to express what Wesleyanism, not the Wesleyan Church, but Wesleyanism, Methodism broadly is. So I'm really encouraged by all of these new expressions and the biblical fidelity that I see in you guys. So I'm really like, I've transferred my credentials to the Global Methodist Church, and I'm thankful for that. I'm in again, not serving a church at this point, but I love the church I'm in and I'm thankful for it. But I'm really glad to see what you guys are doing. It's really exciting time in Wesleyanism.
No, it really is. I agree. I love your perspective on that. 100%.
Well, Eric, you've written a few books about your experience. Can you tell us about that? Or at least one book about your experience? What type of things are you doing that I think as people listen to you, they might really want to check out the work that God's doing through you?
Well, thank you. In 2018, late 2018, I released my first book, which was a 40-day devotional for skeptics. It's called 40 Days of Doubt. 40 Days of Doubt Devotions for the Skeptic, which is just 40 days broken up into 40 questions skeptics ask about Christianity, about the Bible, about God, about social issues and things like that. Really short, snippets that I think are good for beginners. And then in 2021, I released a book called Scripture and the Skeptic, which is more about, how to really embrace the whole Bible as a skeptic and, somebody that might have more questions than answers about religion and things, but to consider the whole of Scripture as God's true and trustworthy word to us. So rather than picking and choosing and the buckets and all of that, like think the whole thing. Yeah. Let's take the whole thing as God's story to us and not discard any of it. So that a Scripture and the Skeptic came out in 2021. And so those are the two I've written. Okay. And then there's the podcast. Yeah.
That's great. And the podcast is called Maybe God?
Maybe God podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah. We just finished our first film, actually. We made a documentary film called Across, and it is about the southern border crisis and a Christian response to it. I'm really proud of it. It comes out on June 20th, and you can find that at acrossdocumentary.com.
Great. Yeah, this is great. Oh, well, I always ask this question. Well, I try to ask this question if I can get it in time. My podcast is called More to the Story. So I'm curious, is there more to the story to Eric? We've got a lot of your story here, but there's something that you don't normally talk about on your podcast, some hobby that you have or something like that?
Some hobby that I have. Well, I'm an avid baseball fan.
Okay.
And, so that's, although I don't really hide that, I'll tell you my most recent guilty pleasure is playing this video game with my kids that I don't think any grown man should play video games unless it's with their kids. And in that case, it's just to be with your kids. It's not really to play the game, My apologies to any grown men that play video games. It's a personal opinion. But,
I'm with you.
Yeah. So I've been playing this Assassin's Creed Odyssey game, which is the most epic video game I've ever seen in my life. But it takes years to finish. And so, but it has been the best bonding time for my kids and I. They're both early teenagers, and so it's been the coolest thing to sort of get into that with them. And also, my last guilty pleasure is that I've become, strangely, a pretty huge Swiftie. So my daughter and I listen to Taylor Swift all the time, and recently went to a Taylor Swift concert.
Oh man, you're in the
she's
cult.
got me. I'm in the cult. She's got me all in, man. So
that is unique. This might be used against you in the future. Okay, what's your baseball team?
The Astros.
Okay.
Don't hold it against me.
With a few cheaters.
I know. You know, God said to love the sinners, right?
Well, I'm a Cubs fan. I grew up in the Chicago area, but look, my life is fulfilled. I 2016.
I like this team, man. I love the Bellinger pickup. So we'll see where that goes.
Well, we can hope. Well, thanks so much for your time, Eric. It's great to for me, just personally, to engage you here, and looking forward to following you and what's happened at the Story Church and the Foundry Network. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Andy, thanks for having me. God bless you, brother.